to Know Christ, a television ministry of the Lutheran Church of Peace in Platteville, Wisconsin. Here is your host, Reverend Jeff Pedersen.
Well, today our lesson is on church and state. And so I'm going to read from Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. Everyone must submit himself to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, he who rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and he will commend you. For he is God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also because of conscience. This is also why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, who give their full time to governing. Give everyone what you owe him. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. I remember when I was living in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, at St. Paul, downtown St. Paul, you've got two beautiful buildings that have got Greco-Roman architecture to them, like with the dome. Well, one of these is the state capital of Minnesota, but not far from it would be the St. Paul Cathedral. Both beautiful buildings, inside and out. And so in some ways, as I stand there in St. Paul, I could see that obviously the capital represents the state, and this big, beautiful cathedral represents the church. But what separates the two? One thing. It's Interstate 94. I-94 separates the two. Well, we've certainly, throughout my lifetime anyway, I've heard this whole debate about the separation of church and state. And Martin Luther said that it's important that we have the separation of church and state. Why? Because when the two get so intertwined together, it generally means problems. It means corruption. Whether it's the state that is corrupting the church or the church that is corrupting the state. And somehow when they get intertwined, I mean, not to say that the church can't be corrupt in itself and that the state can't be corrupt in itself, but for whatever reason that when you put them together, it becomes even worse. And so it's always good to keep them separate, church and state. But here again, our definition or our understanding of this can be wrong. That a lot of times we assume that what church and state separation means is that for the church, that little church over there on the corner, that's the only place where God is allowed to hang out. Otherwise, it's off limits. God, if you dare leave that little church and walk down the steps and get onto the sidewalk, we're going to arrest you, God. We've worked hard now to legislate all the laws to make sure that you don't get out of that little building. And so I think that's what our understanding is with so many things, is that we have the separation of God and whatever. I mean, you look at science. Okay, now, just like church and state, which one is going to be? Are we going to operate by the church or are we going to operate by the state? Well, then I think we do the same thing with science. Okay, what is it going to be? Are we going to be people of faith or are we going to be people of science? It's like we're always needing to make our choice. It's like, well, God, do we show our honor and respect to you, or do we go on our backs and we kind of look to science for some things? It's nonsense. And I'm not just trying to say that the atheists or people who are on this side are the problem. I see a lot of times where we have church leaders and church people that get into the same dynamic. So like if a person is sick, what do? Do we pray, trusting that God is going to heal? I mean, after all, as we read the Bible, that's how Jesus would go about it so often, was that he would pray and they would get healed. And so that's what we think, is that they pray and they will get healed. Now here, that's not to say that there isn't the gift of healing, and I can even vouch for the fact that many times when I've prayed for somebody, and other people have prayed for somebody, that the person has gotten healed. And there's no logical explanation for it. Even the doctor would say, we have no explanation for it other than the fact that you were healed by God. But for the most part, people, they're not going to be seeking prayer from a pastor or somebody who's got the gift of healing or even their neighbor, but rather they're going to be heading down the street to the clinic when they've got some illness. Okay, so it's not either or. When you get sick, yes, we pray. We pray that God will be with you, that God will bring healing, but we have to remember that we have the stewardship of creation, that God has given to all of us abilities. I mean, when it comes to food, do we just pray? I mean, after all, God did send down the manna from heaven. God, Jesus broke the bread and the fish and multiplied the fish, the fish and the loaves of bread to feed the 5,000. So when we're hungry, do we just pray and that somehow, our tables are going to be full of good food? Oh yeah, we pray before our meals and we give thanks. But we here again trust that in God's plan is that I've given to humanity a part to play. I have placed you as stewards of the earth, and so we are thankful for the farmers. We pray and we give thanks, but boy, we need farmers to be raising our food. And that's a spiritual thing. That's something that God has called some people to do. Just like do we pray and hopefully that a building will all of a sudden just appear or an automobile, but no, we're thankful for carpenters and construction workers. That's their stewardship that God has given to them. And so when it comes to the field of medicine, it's the same thing. We're thankful for the stewardship that God has placed in healing for the doctors and the nurses and the pharmacists. And so we'll pray for you as you go to the doctor. And we pray that you will be healed. And the whole thing is a spiritual matter. And so it's not God versus science. Science is studying what God has created and developing. And God is working in and through. And so we got to stop trying to separate God from everything, but see how is God involved in everything. Okay, so I trickle back now to church and state. Because we have church and state, that we don't, that we cannot have the understanding that the church is of God and that the state is like a secular or an atheistic institution. So that the atheist will say, yeah, you church people, you can, the people of God, you can just hang out over at the church, but leave us alone. We as atheists, we got our capital and we've got the state, and that's how we're going to operate. No, we have to understand that both are of God. Yes, they're separate, but both are equally of God. They both are institutions of God. That the state is just as much of God as the church. And that's what Paul is emphasizing here. And so why has God given to us government? Well, the government is to create order in society, to legislate just laws and to enforce them. Government is to protect us, that we have an army, that we have a police force. Government is to provide infrastructure, roads and bridges, waterworks, and all these societal things that we need, such as schools and hospitals. This is just to name some of the things. And so how thankful we are for government, how much we need government to give us that order, to give us that structure, that protection in life, and all the services that the government provides. And so just like the church, that the church operates out of love. It's not like, as a pastor, I pastor a church. I pastor the Lutheran Church of Peace in Platteville. But annually, we do have a stewardship drive, but it's not like I say, well, we are taxing you to keep our church open. Every penny that comes into the church is a gift of love. There's no law that says you have to give this. And if you don't, this is the consequence. No, we give out of love. I love the Lord my God. I've dedicated my life to God. And so I give, my time, my talent, and my possessions to the service of God's work. And that being a baptized member, I am a member of the church. And so I can't be saying, why does the church want this? And why does the church want, oh, the church wants this? No, you are the church. That's what we talked about a couple of weeks ago is in Romans chapter 12, we have Apostle Paul's understanding that when you are baptized, you're made a member of the church. Just like my right hand's a member of my body. Maybe you're the right hand of the church, or the left ear, or the vocal piece. But when it comes to government, well, we may not necessarily be given out of love, but rather obligation under the law. That the government taxes us. And so you're going to pay this whether you want to or not. Now, hopefully all of us have a cheerful attitude, just like we want a cheerful attitude when we give to the church, that we also want a cheerful attitude when we pay our taxes. Understanding all of the good things that government provides. And it's something because, God provides so that we can give our tithes and our offerings to the church. And the promise is that the more that we do this, the more that God will bless us. And like I said, is that we are giving out of love what God has first given us. It's not out of a legal obligation. But yet God provides for our taxes. In Matthew chapter 17, verses 25 through 27, that we hear the story where Jesus is paying his temple tax. And Peter needs to pay his too, Peter being one of Jesus' disciples. And here again we talk about vocation. that we all have a vocation, that we have a role as our stewardship in creation. And Peter's he was a professional fisherman. And so they didn't have money to pay their temple taxes, and what it was 2 drachma. In other words, 2 coins that they would have to pay for their tax. And so what Jesus told Peter was, you go down fishing, and you catch a fish, you open up its mouth, and there will be the coins that you need for both you and me to pay our temple tax. And so Peter went and he caught the fish, and sure enough, there were the 4 coins. Now here again, we kind of think, no, I'm not a professional fisherman. Matter of fact, I'm not even a very good amateur fisherman. I mean, there was a time where I kind of thought I was, and I would kind of brag here and there, and my fish stories got bigger and bigger. But really, when it comes down to it, when I'm with some people fishing, it's just like, man, I'm terrible at this. But in that rare occasion, when I do catch a fish, I do look in its mouth, and there's no coins in there. It's like, oh, I was hoping to catch that big whale of a muskie or a northern pike that would be just full of change that would allow me to pay all of my taxes. And so we look at this once again. It's, kind of going back to, when somebody's sick, do we pray and just trust that this person's miraculously going to get healed? Yes, we do that. But we also say, in God's wisdom, that God has provided this wonderful clinic, these wonderful doctors, and all this medical technology. And so I would really highly encourage you to go there. Because you know what? God will be there, and God is going to be working through all these people, whether they're believers or not, to bring healing to you. And so this whole story about Peter, the fish, and the coins, and so we have to ask, was this a miracle that these coins were in there? Or was the blessing of all of this is that Peter had the gift, the ability to catch fish, that he could now take the fish to the marketplace, and there he can get the 4 coins, and off he goes to pay his taxes. And that's the blessedness of work, isn't it? That God maybe didn't provide all of the money that I need in the mouth of a fish that I kind of accidentally caught the other day, but rather, he's provided me a skill set, and a job so I can go out and earn this money. But I think the whole idea here is to, once again, bring it together in a way to show that, yes, this was a miracle that Peter got this money to pay his taxes. It's a gift from God. But the gift involves himself in a skill to catch fish. And so here we give thanks to the Lord for all that he's given by his grace. It's a gift. I did not make the sun shine today. And I did not purchase its rays. I did not make the rain come down. And I didn't purchase it. And so we think about all these things, that the soil, the sunshine, the rain, the seeds, your heartbeat. It's all grace, isn't it? It's a gift from God. But how he's placed us to be able to work. And yes, this whole issue of money, but we all need money because that's, as we all have our gift that we share, that we all come together as a community. And at least for the most part, in our society, in the way that we live, is that money is our exchange. It's our exchange. So that the fisherman as he makes the money with the drachma or with the coins, can then go and purchase something from the auto mechanic to do some work. In the exchange of the money, then the auto mechanic has something to go downtown to buy bread. And the grocer has some money to now go to the doctor. You see how it all works together as community, and that's what God has planned and desires for us, is to live in a loving, healthy community. But people will say, well, sometimes the government is foul, so we should be rebelling against the government. Well, yeah, okay, and that's the other thing, is that when we look to government, we look to elect God-fearing people. People that say, I pray to God, that's where my values come from. And that's always good because this person is accountable to somebody above oneself. And that this person also looks into the best interests of the people. That this is a person who says, I am in this because I love these people. I'm here to serve these people. I am here to make sure that we have just laws and that those laws are enforced. To make sure that people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That everybody has that opportunity to prosper. And where there is hurt, we will go and we will sow healing. But even so, when we look at church and as we look at state, we have the same principles. You know, for our state leaders, our government leaders, we look to them as being godly people, people whose word we can trust. When they say something, we don't have to question it because this is who they are. And that they're out for the good of the people. And if any one of these people is ever lying, how devastating that is. It's like all of a sudden now you got a crack right down the middle of your state. But the same thing with church leaders. Same thing. These are people who love us, people who turn to God, humble themselves before the Lord. You can trust what they say. You don't ever have to wonder, well, is this leader telling me the truth? Here again, if a church leader is lying to us, well, we put a crack right down the middle of the steeple, haven't we? But still, unfortunately, God did not give the work of the state and the church to the angels, but rather to humans, and we are flawed. And that's why we need to live in the grace of God every day, and that we will sometimes make mistakes, but that's where we pray that God will forgive us and help us and to strengthen us so that we can learn from our mistakes. And that this person's humble enough to say, I did wrong, I didn't try to, but I made an error, I made a mistake, but now this is how I believe that we can overcome it. And hopefully the people are going to be gracious enough to say, okay, we forgive you, let's move on. But still, people will say, in those times where there is severe corruption, do we obey or do we rebel? Well, we can use examples. I think about during the time when Babylonia, when they were the strong empire. This would have been a good time for God's people to rebel. But what did the prophets say? No, you don't rebel, you go along. You allow the defeat to happen and you go to exile, because even though this is how we see things in a day, to know that God sees the big picture. And so we continue to pray to God, knowing that God will see us through this time, and that God has a plan for us. For those of you who know Jeremiah chapter 29, what is it, verse 10, 11, and 12, that God has a plan for you. And he will make his purposes. And so that's what the people were trusting in. That right now, what we need to be doing is attacking. But the prophet said, no, you don't attack. You go. God has a plan for you. And that plan did eventually unfold. And that God brought them back to Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple and Jerusalem, and they got back to life. But we think about God's people during the time of the attack of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. They fought against the Romans, and they were slaughtered. And so that's why Paul is saying, because we say, well, Paul, look at all the persecution. Yeah, it's bad. It's no good. But this is where we pray. And we trust. We give it to God. But in the meantime, we do good for those who harm us. We pray for those who persecute us. We do good for those who are harming us, because, in turning the other cheek and doing good, it's like putting burning coals on their head. They're going to feel ashamed. And they're going to realize that this is not my enemy, but rather this is a person who wants to be my friend. And so we think about protests. Gandhi had peaceful protests. He studied the life of Jesus, and that's what Jesus said. You pray for, you go about your peaceful protest. And for the Indian people, it proved well for them. They got their release from the British. Martin Luther King Jr., he then took that page out of Jesus' notebook and Gandhi's notebook for peaceful protests. And we see a lot of that happening today. And I think when people recognize peaceful protests, it's like, what is your cause? And we become sympathetic. But as soon as there is rioting and looting and killing, then people will lose all sympathy for the cause. It's like, well, not only don't I have no sympathy for you, but I've got a lot of anger toward you. And so that's why operating out of a peaceful measure rather than a violent measure is always going to win out. And that's the way that Jesus said. Jesus died on a cross, a violent but yet a peaceful way. But as a result, God had a plan that Jesus Christ is arisen, and because he lives, we too have victory, and we too shall live.
You have been watching To Know Christ with Reverend Jeff Pedersen, pastor of the Lutheran Church of Peace in Platteville, Wisconsin. The worship schedule for the Lutheran Church of Peace is Saturday night at 6 p.m. and Sunday morning at 9 a.m. A collection of Pastor Pedersen's Christian books can be found at Amazon.com. His latest book is called Sharing Our Faith in the Covenant of God's Grace. Thank you for watching, and tune in again next week for To Know Christ.